Well, happy Sunday, everybody. Welcome back to week 8 of our study through the second part of Matthew. And it does seem rather appropriate that we are spending our time walking through the arrest and trial and leading up to the crucifixion, especially now, because we are celebrating Palm Sunday today. We're getting into Holy Week all this week. So it's a little fortuitous, not saying that we planned this at all. It just worked out. So there you go. Last week we wrapped up the Olivet Discourse, and I'm sure you all have a very clear understanding of the end times now. You have that all figured out. It's all clear as mud, right? We're all good there. What is clear through the Olivet Discourse is that he's being very pastoral. He's teaching his disciples about the kingdom, and he wants to prepare them for what's to come. And he concludes with an important closing line. When we do things for others, it's like we're doing them for Jesus himself. And I want to remind you that that was the closure of the fifth discourse. I've showed you this chart several times. We're done with the extended teachings. We have what Jesus wants us to know, at least what Matthew believed was important to get across as he described the kingdom. And now we move to what is referred to as the Passion narrative. In fact, you can tell that we're done because of how it concludes. Normally, when Jesus is done with one of his sayings, it says, when Jesus had finished these sayings. But did you see 26 verse 1? It says, now when Jesus had finished all these sayings. It's putting a closure to all 5 of those discourses and say, well, we're done with that teaching through words, and now we're going to do some teaching through actions. His actions, his passions will have much more to say to us. Now, just because we're done with this doesn't mean that the teaching is over. In fact, Matthew is going to take over the job. And he's going to fill this chapter and the next chapter especially with a ton of meaning that is direct from the Old Testament. At times it's going to be obvious and it's going to say that this is fulfilling something. And at times it's just going to be allusions using similar language that we've heard elsewhere. But time and time again, the point that Matthew seems to be driving us towards is that there's nothing surprising about this. This was always part of the plan. This was the goal in the first place. But we'll see that. Let's dive right in. Chapter 26, starting in verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to the disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Then the chief priests, the elders of the people, gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, the term for delivered, to deliver him over to be crucified. Some translations use the phrase handed over, and other places in our passage today uses the term betrayed. In chapter 26 and 27, it's going to use that terminology 14 times. But let's be abundantly clear here. Who is doing the handing over? Is it Judas handing over? Disciples? Is it the high priest here? No, it's God. This is all being done in God's plan, in God's time. In fact, Jesus gives us this with his little simplicity. He says, guys, 2 more days and it's going to happen. He's been doing that over and over, right? My time is not yet come. It's not happening yet. It's going to happen during this particular time. 2 days, and just a little while later, he's going to say, it's here. He's showing us his omniscience, knowing everything that's going to happen, past, present, and future, and being there. But this term, handing over or being delivered, appears repeatedly throughout the Old Testament with reference to people being handed over to judgment. In fact, it's the same term that Paul uses in Romans chapter 1. You may be familiar with this, where it talks about since the creation of the world, all of the attributes of God have been clearly seen so that man are without excuse, but they don't love God the way they're supposed to. Therefore, they are handed over to a particular way of life instead. Making a statement that being handed over to judgment. This is also used in Isaiah 53. If you haven't read Isaiah 53 recently, go read it. because it connects explicitly to what we're talking about here, including that phrase being handed over or being delivered. You see that in Isaiah 53:6. So we see how God is planning all of this out, and at the same time, we see human action with the scheming of the religious leaders and the elders. Just one more thing to note here, it's Passover, a Jewish festival where they are celebrating the fact that a sacrificial lamb saved the people of Israel from death. We're about to celebrate a new Passover. There is great meaning that's going on here. Verse 6. Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. She poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And when disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." It's a lot of curious things going on here, right from the beginning. The house of Simon the leper. Throughout the rest of the history of the world, he's going to be known as Simon, some random Simon, we don't know who he is, the leper. And yet people are coming over to his house, which tells us that most likely he is a recently healed leper. A man who would have been removed from fellowship, shouting, "Unclean, unclean, stay away from me," is now gathering people at his house. By the way, this is a very different location from the palace of the high priest that we hear about in verse 3. My nerdiness is on display when I say this, I know this, but the first thing that comes to my mind is a change of scenery when you go from like the Empire, where you're in a very dark location and it's very intimidating, to a more pleasant place where everyone's getting along and there's celebration. Or maybe to use another example, what you see in Narnia. You know, when you're in the presence of the White Witch compared to when you're in the presence of Aslan and feasting together. It seems like this latter one is a much more pleasant one, and yet all we know is at the house of Simon the leper. And there a woman pours an expensive ointment on his head. Now, there are other versions of this story in the other Gospels. At times we have a story where ointment is poured on Jesus' feet, or other examples where we actually know the name of the woman. That's not what's happening here. So why do we have an unnamed woman pouring ointment on his head? Perhaps it's pouring oil to be a king, as a coronation. If you're with us with our Samuel study, you know in 1 Samuel 16, that's what happened for David. And it continues that theme because just a few chapters later, we watch how Jesus was paraded into Jerusalem as a king. Well, we can see this connection. The other men didn't seem to have caught this. His own disciples, because what do? Well, they sit around, they note the cost. Elsewhere, we're told that this ointment may have cost 300 denarii, which would have been almost a year's wage. So very expensive. And then they play the social justice card. We aren't sitting in the palace. We're hanging out with former leper. We help the poor. Tisk, tisk. So, you should be doing better things with this. But how does Jesus respond? Jesus does not give us this vague notion of the poor, but the woman. He's saying, no, look at what she has done for me. By the way, this phrase, "the poor will you always have with you," comes from Deuteronomy 15. And this passage is frequently used as an argument to say, thus we don't have to help the poor. That's not Jesus' point at all. In fact, I would argue that Jesus is bringing up a reference to Deuteronomy 15 to say, if you were actually following what Deuteronomy 15 told you to do, then there would be no poor, because that idea of love would be taking care of someone so that it wouldn't be an issue anymore. So this is not made to give some sort of excuse here. No, Jesus seems to be calling out a failure to live out the law, but also He's saying, guys, there's something else going on here. Yeah, in principle, give to the poor. He mentioned that in the previous chapter. We understand that. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. But I'm about to die. And this woman is preparing my body for burial. In this circumstance, in this situation, it makes sense. In fact, he goes so far as to say, truly I say to you, pay attention, giving anything of value for the sake of Jesus. You might contrast that with that rich young ruler. We have no idea what this financial situation of this woman is, but we've heard about a bunch of rich people who can't be separated from their money. And they just grasp onto it and will refuse to give it away for the sake of Jesus. This woman does. Verse 14. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment on, he sought an opportunity to betray or to deliver or to hand him over. 2 more times in this idea, we have this idea of delivering or handing over. 30 pieces of silver. Since we're keeping track, 30 pieces of silver equals about 120 denarii, less than half the cost of the ointment that was used by this woman. And Judas is referred to as one of the 12. He'll be referred to that way again. It stings a little more. Now, we aren't surprised by this because you know this story probably. You didn't get here and be like, I can't believe that happened. In fact, if you approach this and knew nothing else about this, back in Matthew 10, we had that little foreshadowing, remember? And there was Judas who would betray Jesus. And was like, what? I didn't know that was going to happen. We knew that was coming, but it's still shocking. Because when you contrast it with that unnamed woman that we just talked about, she was willing to give so much more of herself for seemingly meaningless purposes, at least from an outward perspective. Pastor David has made this point a couple times before, and I really appreciate it. How we go out into the world to share the news of Jesus and to try to help in very practical ways. And sometimes those quote-unquote practical ways are not going to last long. We build wooden homes and they're going to get knocked down by another hurricane. We try to prop up people with the goods and services they need, and then, well, their country falls back into gang warfare and it falls apart. And people say, was that really a good use of your resources or your funds? And Pastor David's response is, well, doesn't just have the whiff of Jesus to it? To give of yourself even when it doesn't necessarily make sense. To give openly, to give sacrificially. That's exactly what the woman is doing, and that's exactly what Judas is not doing. And he's not even taking a good sum for it. It's less than half of what the woman is getting. In that context, we move to the celebration of the Passover. Verse 17, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where would you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did just as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. There's a lot of things going on in this passage that we don't have a lot of information for. We don't know the name of the woman who poured out that ointment. We don't know the name of the man or the house that they were staying in. It's interesting because Jesus not only has secret enemies among his friends in terms of Judas, but he has secret friends among his enemies. People who are there to help him as well, people who are around. And he tells his disciples, we've been doing the countdown, everybody. It's now. My time is at hand. But he's very interested in, before actually going away and being betrayed, to spend this time with his disciples. And can we pause and just say, verse 19, they did it? Congratulations. Look, we have one example where they're like, Jesus told you to go do something. Throughout the entire book of Matthew, your job has been to put a little black A wherever Jesus showed authority. Finally, he can do it with his disciples and say, they listened to me. That's going to fall apart momentarily, but let's hold on to all the little wins that we can before things are about to change. Okay? Verse 20. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful, began to say to him one after another, is it I, Lord? He answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who would betray him, answered, is it I, Rabbi? He said to him, you have said so. Now, there's this back and forth that I hope you're continuing to pick up on because it's so important, where there is both God's sovereignty and human action going on. You can hear that clearly in verse 24. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. This is the plan. This is the way it was supposed to be forever. Ever since the creation of the world, this plan was put into place to say there would be this great redemption story. And woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better if that man had not been born. There is still the human responsibility, and Judas is going to feel that. All the disciples in response to that statement, one of you will betray me, is it me? And once again, I want to give kudos to the disciples. Because Jesus says, someone's going to betray me. And it's very easy for them to say, no, that we would never do anything like that. In fact, they're going to do that in just a few passages, right? But here it seems to lead to, well, reflection, introspection. It's easy for us to say, I would never do something like that, which, by the way, Peter's going to say later as well. But here they're saying, I need to think about that. Because the fact is, since the betrayal in the garden, we all have betrayed. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said the line between good and evil is not between man and individual men. I'm screwing up his quote right now, but you get the idea. But in the heart of every man. For us to go around and say, yeah, this is something we need to pause and actually think about. It requires this self-examination. There are some commentators who look at verse 25 and say that there's an ambiguity here. Jesus doesn't say yes. He says, you have said so. And some commentators would argue that this leaves room for repentance, which is an interesting thing to think about. Verse 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. With you. Drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Jesus is Emmanuel. Jesus is God with us. And he's saying, I'm here. I'm going away. But there will be a day when I will be with you in my Father's kingdom. They're together celebrating this Passover feast, a mark of deliverance from slavery and death. One person once noted that to actually put the blood on the doorpost, as the Israelites had to do, they had to go on the top and then put it on the frame, making the sign of the cross. That could be just one big coincidence. But it's marking out the idea that there is a sacrifice here. Passover provided deliverance from slavery and death. And then they developed a common ceremony where they celebrated the Passover annually together. But Jesus pauses it. And here he interrupts and takes two of the elements that would have been included in a typical Passover Seder and attaches new symbolic significance to them. And his final parable that he's going to give here relates to bread and wine. This has become so important that we celebrate it consistently. In fact, it is the only thing that we as Christians do repeatedly as some sort of sacramental formula. We do baptism as well, but we argue that's a one-time thing. But this is something that we do repeatedly, over and over. It has great meaning and significance. And when are we doing it? Well, we're reminded of that typical communion formula on the night he was betrayed. Why do we say it that way? Well, it's true. It's because it's on the night he was betrayed, but it's the terminology that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians when he is being handed over. But this could have just fallen away. This could have been just one of those other things that happened and then you move on. But no, this has become central for us. Why is it such a big deal? In fact, if you were here this morning, we celebrated communion, and we're going to do it again on Thursday as part of our Maundy Thursday services. Well, Jesus is appropriating covenantal language here. He's taking ideas that go all the way back to Abraham, and he's bringing them to a very new and real meaning. See, covenants frequently include broken or divided flesh and spilled blood. You may be familiar with this story. It's in Genesis 15. It's this idea where Abram, in pre-Abraham times, was in a relationship with God. And there was a covenant there. But it seemed a little far-fetched because Abram was going to be the father of many nations. He was already 90 at the time. There was problems with that. That doesn't really work out particularly well. Okay, so there's going to be issues. How does that work out? And yet, repeatedly, God says it's going to happen this way. And he endorses the covenant in Genesis 15. And to do that, he actually takes a bunch of animals, slices them in half, and lies them on two sides. And in general, this idea with the blood and the broken flesh would be a sign of the covenant to say, if you break this covenant, that's what's going to happen to you too. But what's interesting about what happens in Genesis 15 is Abram never actually walks through that line. He's asleep the entire time. And the story in Genesis 15 points to a sensor, a light that just moves through that as an indicator of God illustrating that covenant. The broken flesh and the blood is there. Here we see something that's just going to be a little different, because the broken flesh would come from someone who broke the covenant. If you break it, then these things are going to happen to you. But here Jesus says, no, this is my flesh, the broken flesh. It's going to come from the one who kept it perfectly. Here's the other thing that's interesting. When it happened with Abraham, he didn't have to eat the animals. But here Jesus says, take, eat. Do this in remembrance of me. Why is it so important that we ingest the bread and the wine? Well, I think this gets a lot to do with the simple fact that Jesus was never meant to change our outsides. We will be changed on the outside, but he had a lot more to do with changing our insides. He had just criticized the Pharisees, remember? They clean the outside of the bowl, they make it look nice and clean, but the inside is really disgusting. You don't really want to eat that way. Jesus had a much more focused purpose here, to get to the heart of things by cleaning the hearts, by correcting what is truly wrong with people. And he criticizes people for saying you're focused on the outside when you're just whitewashed tombs. See, Jesus' disciples had to eat this because it's a marker of what's going inside of us. It's changing our hearts. We aren't supposed to be sparkling clean, whitewashed tombs. We are in need of a Savior to clean us from the inside out. So when we take the communion meal, we remember that we have been cleaned on the inside. Just one more thing, the drinking of the blood, the wine, most commentators would argue that this is actually the third cup that would be drunk, one of four during the whole Passover Seder. The third cup is known as the cup of redemption. But then Jesus says at the end of this, I will not drink again until I drink with you in the Father's kingdom. That fourth cup is known as a cup of praise. And that's when the celebration happens. That's when the excitement comes. But he's not there yet. So we're in the process of redemption. Let's move on. Verse 30, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Now Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Now, once again, what's hitting the disciples the hardest here? Well, it hits them how they will betray Jesus. And it's interesting that they aren't really taken by this whole idea of how he says he's going to rise again. It's like you're missing the lead here, people. Coming back to life, that's a big deal. But they're focused on the betrayal aspect here. But then you get to Peter. Though they will fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Someone said that we should, never use never. Because using superlatives like this puts us in the place of God. Instead, we should be recognizing, but for the grace of God go I. Peter thinks he has it all figured out. We're going to realize very quickly he does not. There's going to be issues that he faces here. And Jesus calls him out. Verse 34, Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same. The fact that Jesus not only says he's going to do it, but he gives him receipts. He's like, here's how it's going to work. You're going to do it this many times. It's going to happen before daybreak. Can I give you any more information to convince you that it's actually going to be this way and maybe change your mind before you actually get there? But it doesn't. Jesus makes it particularly clear. Verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here, watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, interesting, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed, turned over into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Peter's getting a rough shot here and probably deserves it. But it's just interesting that he's the one specifically that Jesus calls out. Peter and the sons of Zebedee, James and John, go with him. And yet Peter, didn't you just say you were never going to desert me? And yet you can't stay awake for a little while? That's a little odd, Peter. Little odd. But what do we get from Jesus here? Well, it's perfect human submission. I don't want to do this. Have you ever told God that? I have. And yet, Not my will, but yours. It's interesting to note that it's Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, that go with him, because that's not the only time that's happened. You'll recall that Peter, James, and John went with Jesus to the mountain for the Transfiguration. And what did they learn on the Mount of Transfiguration? That he was truly God. They just got a glimpse of his deity. What do they get to see here? They get to see his humanity. Because this was the whole plan. This was the whole idea for Jesus to come and to do this. And what is he saying now? Man, I really don't want to do this. And can you blame him? You get this anxiousness, this even depression going on here over what was to come. You get his sorrow, his grief. Well, at least they learned that when they were not fully asleep, right? And they recognized that. But by the way, Abram, remember, was asleep during the making of the covenant as well. So they're in good company there. Many believe that this is the moment here during the prayer when the new covenant begins. Jesus is saying, I don't want to do this, but I commit myself to your will. I will do this. Everything's going to happen, but here's where it begins. Verse 47, while he was still speaking, Judas came. One of the 12, that sting is still there. Didn't have to be one of the 12, but it is. And with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, greetings, Rabbi. And he kissed him. Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. This kiss is not out of the ordinary. It's a greeting of a friend, and Jesus calls him friend. But why? Is he being snarky? Well, in Matthew, the term friend is used a couple other times. It's interesting to note. Once used with the parable of the workers, when the owner of the fields is talking about to those complaining about their wages. And another time in the parable of the wedding feast, where the king went out to the countryside to find anyone who wanted to come. Everyone could come, but there was that one guy who didn't have the proper attire. Both of those were referred to as friend. It speaks of a relationship where one side may have kept their end of the deal, but the other side is pushing back, is being a little rebellious. And you can look at that both positively and negatively. Negatively as an accusation towards Judas, but also positively saying, I'm still here. You want one more chance to make a different choice? Think about it. But he doesn't. In verse 50, they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. Behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Now we read elsewhere that this is Peter, but it doesn't say Peter here, perhaps because we are too focused on Peter's denial, but also maybe because we should see ourselves here. You could understand yourself in this position, right? Wanting to do anything that you possibly could to save your teacher. And that's why it stands out so strongly when Jesus says, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Peter, don't you get it yet? This is my upside down kingdom. It was never going to come by force. It was going to come always through submission. In fact, for 53, do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? Each legion has 6,000 soldiers in it. So we're talking 72,000 angels. Jesus is using hyperbole here again to say if this was just a matter of might, he could take care of things very easily. In fact, that's how Satan tempted Jesus all the way back in Matthew 4, right? Jump off, let your angels catch you. I know you can do it. Jesus saying, yeah, could have then, could have now, if I want to get out of this situation. But that's not the point. He doesn't want to call the angels because he has a purpose. Verse 54, how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? But then he has some words for the religious leaders. He says to the crowds, have you come out as against a robber with swords, clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all the disciples left him and fled. You guys could have come during the day. You didn't have to stay up so late. You could have just found me wherever. I was in the temple. Like, I was there. You knew that I was going to be there. You could have come got me, but you want to do it this way? Oh, okay. And they do. And he's arrested, and they take him to a trial. Kind of. It's kind of a trial. Verse 57, those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. Going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. So where we are right now is in the Sanhedrin. It would be essentially Israel's form of the Supreme Court, so to speak, although at this point they didn't have the ability to sentence anyone to death. That was relegated to the Roman rulers that they would have had there instead. There would have been 71 members there under Caiaphas, and we get to hear of the charade that's going on, where person after person gives liars who are lying, and even in their lying, they can't get their story straight. And it takes over and over and over until finally, at the end of 62 came forward. Why do they need that? Well, where 2 or 3 are gathered, you can have a clear testimony. But just a testimony of 1, that's not enough. Finally, 2 figure out how to say the same thing. This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus remains silent. He doesn't argue back until he has a direct question, which recalls Isaiah 53 here. But when he finally is asked a question, he said, yeah, you knew it. It is this way. I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God, Son of Man, and not only that. And then he quotes this famous prophecy from Daniel 7. It's obvious to anyone who is paying attention that he is now claiming to be the Son of God. By the way, I say obvious to anyone paying attention because I've heard people look at this and say, well, Jesus never claims to be God. This, in that terminology of the day, would be claiming to be God. He's making that statement, and that's why they react the way they do. The high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. Which, yeah, if it were untrue, this would be blasphemous. And so from the high priest's perspective, yep, what further witnesses do you need? We have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They answered, he deserves death. They spit on his face, struck him, some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? Verse 68 says, if you are such a prophet, you should know who hits you. You understand the incredible irony there? Because the prophecies about Jesus' death related to him being struck, and they didn't catch that. Verse 69, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. Jesus was just speaking truth to power. And Peter feels the need to lie to the powerless. It's a girl. It's a servant girl. It's someone of no consequence whatsoever. And Peter, the one who came along and said, I will never abandon you, all of a sudden says, who? Nope, got the wrong guy. But it keeps going. When he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him. And she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. Pay attention to this. The first said it was with him, or Peter was with him. But then another one comes and, qualifies it. And all of a sudden, you have those two. Remember, 2 or 3 with them. So all of a sudden, there was enough to make the statement that Peter was with Jesus. And Peter gets really worried. And Peter doubles down. And he uses an oath. Some people make a big deal about talking about this oath in terms of vulgarity or swearing. He's just saying an oath. Remember, Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, don't do it. Let your yes be yes, no be no. And Peter took it a step further and is just going against this. And then verse 73, after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you two are one of them, for your accent betrays you. He's a country boy. He's a redneck from Galilee. And so they hear his dialect and they know exactly where he's from. I can recognize that twang anywhere. You were with that man. But he began to invoke a curse, this time on himself, and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter is doing the opposite of what he was called to do. He was called to let his light shine. He was called to not deny Jesus before men, and Peter messes up. But Jesus doesn't. And because Jesus does not mess up, our mess ups are redeemed by the cross. Peter, in the heat of the moment, didn't recognize what was going on. But one more thing, Jesus knew. In your homework, you looked over Psalm 139, verse 4. Before a word is ever on my tongue, you, O Lord, know it. He's familiar with what we say even before we say it. He's familiar with what we do before we even do it. He knows about you and me. I myself may deny him, but Jesus never denies the Father. And the Father accepts me in spite of myself. That's why we celebrate the Lord's Supper. That's why we remember what we're talking about this week. When we take those beautiful pieces of the covenant, we know that God already knows what we have done and what we will do, and that our covenant with God covers them. Just one quick point for a takeaway. We go back and forth in our understandings and our thought process about who Jesus is, and it's something that the church has wrestled with constantly. I'm hoping as you studied through this chapter 26, that you can see both God as the King of the universe, and Jesus is certainly there, and Jesus is also man. And we get this illustration of a God who can predict time and know what is coming and fulfill prophecies that were stated hundreds of years previously, and even allow the arrest to occur, as Jesus himself notes. It says, I could stop it, but I'm here. Let's do it. And at the same time, we get Jesus' humanity so clear with the agony and distress that he goes for, with just the need for friends to come along or around him and to support him in his hour of need. And that call that we all would make, take this cup from me. I can't do this. We get Jesus as someone who has borne our weaknesses, who has lived like we have, And we also serve a Jesus who is the King of the universe. When we come back in 2 weeks, because we'll be taking next Sunday off for Easter, we'll get to the culmination of the Passion. It's a hard week, but it's an important week to spend time on. Let's pray together. So God, we pause, and I pause with thankfulness, because all that we're talking about today are things that I don't deserve, and yet I recognize that because of Jesus, I can have them. And I'm so thankful for what Jesus did. I'm thankful for the example that we have. And I'm thankful for this new covenant that we live under with this bread and with this cup as a marker of what Jesus did for us some 2,000 years ago. I pray that this would be on our minds even this week as we celebrate another Holy Week. And we pray that would be to your glory. We pray to you, Father, in the name of your Son and by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good week, and we'll see you back for our next study 2 weeks from today.